Hi, everyone. It's Wednesday after the 11th Sunday after Pentecost, and that means it's time for another Wednesday Word. And this week's Wednesday Word is about words, specifically about the way we use language and why it's important to be careful about the language that we use. I've been thinking about this for a couple of reasons. The first is that August is a time where I often think back to my seminary years because my seminary education started in the middle of August with a 2-week gauntlet of learning Greek, a whole semester of Greek over 2 weeks. That time I spent having to dig into another language forced me to think a lot about the language that I speak and use every day, which is English, and how some of the things that I take for granted about English are really just quirks of our language. One of those things, for example, is the use of the generic masculine. It's something that was long used for people and particularly used for God. But why? English is one of the languages in the world that doesn't have what's called grammatical gender. If in school you learned German or French or Spanish or studied one of those sort of languages, then you studied a language that has grammatical gender, and you had to learn what gender particular nouns had, and you had to make sure that your adjectives and your sentence structures all agreed with that grammatical gender. And sometimes it probably felt really weird. You had to think about why a table had feminine gender, or why a door had feminine gender, but why things like a chair may have had a particular grammatical gender. In English, we're not saddled with that same problem. It's not something that we carried from the other languages that make up English. And yet, we have this persistent issue of using the masculine gender generically when we talk about people or when we talk about God. And I didn't realize how pervasive this was until I began to study these other languages that had grammatical gender. One of the things we talked about in seminary was the challenge of how grammatical gender hardens in our heads over time, and how things that are supposed to be metaphorical become concrete in a way that's sometimes not helpful. And this is true of what happened around the word God and the fact that so many of us use he reflexively when we refer to God, especially the first person of the Trinity. Hebrew and Greek both had grammatical gender, and in those languages, particularly their ancient versions, the masculine grammatical gender was considered to be the sort of default. And so if you were describing something that didn't have a gender assigned to it already, the masculine gender was automatically assumed and it was used. So when Scripture was translated from Koine Greek and ancient Hebrew into English, those masculine pronouns showed up all over the place. And being dutiful translators who wanted to make things look as accurate as possible in those manuscripts, people who translated the biblical languages into English and gave us the Bible as we read it today, used the pronouns and the language that was in the Scriptures. And so, consistently throughout Scripture, for hundreds and hundreds of years in English, we had all the persons of the Trinity referred to as he. Now, that's not necessarily problematic as long as we recognize the metaphorical nature of all of our language for God. God, being divine, is totally other. God, in many ways, defies our attempts to describe God. But when we use the same sort of language over and over and over again, as I said, it has this habit of becoming more concrete in our heads than it should. And so a lot of people over the centuries have internalized the idea that God is male. As we've come to understand more about God, as we've come to understand more about language, as we become more sensitive to the ways that language matters in our interactions with one another, that's become really troublesome for a lot of people. There's often a lot of pushback on this, saying, well, when people refer to God as He, they recognize that God is beyond gender. I'm not so sure that all of us do, though, because of how this language has become so internalized. And the way I know this is because of how many people have a visceral reaction when we use feminine pronouns to refer to God, particularly the first person of the Trinity, who is often described as God the Father, another metaphor that's used in Scripture for God. We might recognize intellectually that God is beyond gender, but then why do so many people have such a strong reaction when we refer to God as she? What is it about that language that causes those feelings to rise up in so many of us? I think that discomfort should tell us something about how the language we use about God has hardened. And it should maybe give us some pause when we scoff at the sort of attempts that I think are really, really important and fruitful for the church to do this work of considering our language for God. Because if we can't conceive of God in feminine terms, if we can't use feminine language to describe God, what does it say about us when we profess our belief that all of us, men and women and gender nonconforming people, are made in the image of God? How can we really say that we believe those things if we can't refer to God using language that is used to describe half or more of the people living on the planet who are said to be made in God's image? I'm not suggesting that you need to be immediately comfortable with using feminine imagery for God, or that you're wrong to use masculine imagery or language for God. But I do think it's important for all of us to ponder why it is that expansive language seems so threatening. And I think it's because of how language works, how language hardens, how this idea of God being masculine has become connected to our human institutions, in which men have so often disproportionately held power and authority. Language matters. And to the extent that we can become more powerful, more comfortable thinking about God in these expansive ways, the more comfortable we're going to be questioning the powers and the systems that are in place in our own society. The ones that say that men have more of a right to rule than women or gender nonconforming people. The ones that privilege men above other folks. I know this is strange stuff to think about for some of you, particularly if you have a long history of using only masculine imagery for God. But if it's true that our language about God is all metaphorical, then it's also true that the moment those metaphors start to harden, they become less useful. So let's think about all the vast imagery that's used in Scripture to describe God and how God relates to God's people. Jesus describes himself as a mother hen who wished to gather chicks under his wings. In the First Testament, God is described as a mother who could not forget the babes that would nurse at God's breast. There are so many ways that language about God is more expansive than the ones that have so often been centered in our discourse, in hymns, in prayers, in the ways that we talk about God during our religious services. And to the extent that we can expand that language and become more comfortable thinking about who God is, the more we can see in other people who are different from us the image and the likeness of God. And that's what we're called to do. So I know this is strange and challenging, but I hope that you'll join me in continuing to think about how we can talk about God in ways that honor the great diversity of God's creation and the human family to which we all belong. I'll see you again next week for another Wednesday Word. Take care, everyone. Bye.